7,000 horses charged across the plain, and the men riding them did something that had never happened before. They turned around, not slowly, not reluctantly. They wheeled their mounts and fled, covering their faces with their hands, abandoning the archers and slingers behind them, leaving everything they had been sent to destroy completely untouched. Elite cavalry. The finest horsemen from Gaul, Germany, Thrace, Anatolia, Syria. Men who had never broken in their lives. Running. Ancient sources document the military situation with brutal clarity. Julius Caesar's army numbered 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Pompey the Great's army numbered approximately 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. A 2-to-1 disadvantage in foot soldiers. A 7-to-1 disadvantage in horse. 6 weeks earlier, Pompey had already beaten Caesar in the field at Dyrrachium, inflicting roughly 1,000 casualties, capturing several standards, and sending Caesar's army retreating into Thessaly. Caesar was not the aggressor here. He was the one running. So what did Caesar do? He stopped running, found a plain, and waited. But here's what historians have never fully answered. Why did Pompey, the man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 90 days, who held 2-to-1 odds in infantry and 7-to-1 in cavalry, who had already beaten Caesar once, ride back to his tent and sit in silence while his army disintegrated outside? This was Rome's greatest living general, a man Plutarch describes as having received the submission of kings. Something happened at Pharsalus that didn't just defeat his army. It broke him personally before a single sword touched him. The ancient sources describe the silence. They never explain it. By the end of this video, you'll understand 3 documented facts that make Pharsalus unlike any other battle in Roman history. Caesar's decisive weapon wasn't a legion. It was a deliberate gap in his own battle line, a concealed formation that appears nowhere else in Roman military doctrine, described in Caesar's own account of the war he fought. The man who struck the first blow that day wasn't even on active duty. He was retired, he came back voluntarily, and he made Caesar a promise that Caesar recorded word for word in his own history of the battle. And the most consequential decision Caesar made after winning wasn't a military order at all. It was a choice not to read his enemy's private mail. And the men he spared because of it would eventually put 23 blades into him on the Senate floor. To understand why a man fighting from apparent strength collapsed without resistance, we need to go back to Rome. And the moment one man's legal problem set the Mediterranean world on fire. The Roman Republic did not collapse because of Julius Caesar. It collapsed because of what it had become. An institution designed to govern a city-state that found itself managing a Mediterranean empire, sustained by informal power-sharing arrangements between men whose ambitions the system could no longer contain. Caesar was not the cause of the breakdown. He was the man standing at the fault line when it finally gave. For nearly a decade, 3 men had served as an unofficial stabilization mechanism for Roman politics. Julius Caesar provided military genius and popular appeal. Marcus Licinius Crassus provided money, almost incomprehensible quantities of it, enough to buy political neutrality from most of the Senate on most questions. And Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus provided reputation, the accumulated prestige of 3 military triumphs and 2 decades of victories from Spain to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Together, they formed what historians call the First Triumvirate. Not a formal institution, not a legal arrangement, but a mutual understanding that held the Republic's competing factions in rough equilibrium. Then, in 53 BC, a Parthian army destroyed the Roman force at Carrhae, and Crassus died in the desert with his legions. The financial buffer was gone. The political mediator was gone. Our two men with incompatible ambitions faced each other across the ruins of the arrangement. And there was nothing left between them. The personal bonds dissolved alongside the political ones. Caesar's daughter Julia, who had married Pompey as part of the original understanding, died in childbirth in 54 BC. Plutarch and Suetonius both record this death as a turning point, not merely a personal tragedy, but the severing of the one relationship that made rivalry human rather than structural. After Julia, the two men were competitors who had run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. What made the situation lethal was geography and law. Caesar had spent 8 years conquering Gaul, and his command was expiring. His enemies in Rome, the conservative faction known as the Optimates, and led by Cato the Younger, had publicly sworn to prosecute him the moment he stepped back onto Italian soil as a private citizen. The charges concerned his conduct during his consulship in 59 BC and throughout the Gallic Wars. Suetonius records that Cato swore this oath openly, repeatedly, with the unmistakable intention of destroying Caesar the moment his legal immunity expired. Caesar's dignitas, the Roman concept of personal honor and standing inseparable from his military command, was not a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. He had asked the Senate to allow him to stand for the consulship of 48 BC while still holding his command, so that he could transition directly from imperium to office without the gap in which prosecution became possible. The Senate, backed by Pompey, refused, and then the Senate issued its emergency decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, in January of 49 BC, ordering Caesar to disband his legions. The message was clear: come back as a private citizen, or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar's response was documented by every major ancient source. On January 10th or 11th of 49 BC, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River, the legal boundary between his province and Italy proper, and began marching toward Rome. Not with 10 legions, not with a massive show of overwhelming force, with one. The famous remark attributed to him at that crossing, "The die is cast," is recorded differently by different sources. Plutarch places it in Pompey's biography, while Suetonius records the substance without confirming the exact language. Now, what is not disputed is the act itself or its meaning. By crossing the Rubicon with an armed legion, Caesar committed treason against the Roman state. He started a civil war, and Pompey, who had no ready army in Italy, made the decision that would define everything that followed. He retreated, not to fight, but to regroup, eastward across the Adriatic to Greece, where the wealth of the eastern provinces and the armies of Rome's client kingdoms would give him time to build the force he needed to end things properly. It was rational strategy. It was also the decision that gave Caesar a year to transform from a threatened politician into the most dangerous military commander in the ancient world. The Republic's last chance for a negotiated settlement walked out of Italy on Pompey's heels, and the road it left open led straight to a plain in Thessaly. Picture a man who had been preparing for an impossible situation his entire life without knowing it. Gaius Julius Caesar was born on July 12th or 13th of 100 BC. The exact year is noted by Britannica as potentially placing his birth in 99 BC. Though 100 BC is the traditional and most widely accepted date. He came from the patrician gens Julia, a family so ancient it claimed descent from Aeneas and the goddess Venus. What the family had in history, it lacked in wealth. His father, also named Gaius, had reached the rank of praetor but left no great fortune. His aunt Julia's marriage to Gaius Marius, 7-time consul, reformer of the Roman legions, but the dominant figure of his generation, gave Caesar his only connection to real political power. And that connection nearly got him killed. When Marius's enemy Sulla seized Rome in 82 BC and began his proscriptions, Caesar was a teenager connected by blood to the man Sulla had spent a career fighting. Sulla ordered him to divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Marius's political ally Cinna. Caesar refused. He went into hiding. He survived only because family members with Sullan connections interceded on his behalf. Sulla relented, reportedly observing that there were many Mariuses in this young man, meaning he recognized a threat and chose not to eliminate it. The lesson Caesar absorbed from those years was not gratitude for mercy. It was that institutions were tools, that personal courage could be politically deployed, and that survival sometimes required doing the thing that everyone around you was certain would get you killed. The military career that followed demonstrated all three lessons simultaneously. He served in Asia under Marcus Minucius Thermus, earning the civic crown for valor at the siege of Mytilene, the second highest military decoration the Republic awarded, given to a soldier who saved the life of a fellow citizen in combat. He was captured by Cilician pirates around 75 BC, held for ransom, and spent his captivity making jokes about what he would do to them when he was free. They laughed. He assembled a fleet after his release, hunted them down, and crucified them. Both Suetonius and Plutarch record this episode. Whether every colorful detail they provide is accurate is less certain than the core fact. A man who told pirates he would execute them and then did exactly that was a man who did not make promises casually. The Gallic Wars, running from 58 to 50 BC, built something that could not be bought or inherited or politically arranged. 8 years of continuous campaigning created the most experienced infantry force in the Roman world, and it created a relationship between Caesar and his soldiers that was the military foundation of everything he subsequently accomplished. His men had conquered approximately 300 Gallic and Germanic tribes. They had crossed the Rhine twice, invaded Britain twice, and at the siege of Alesia in 52 BC, had constructed 2 sets of fortifications simultaneously. One to besiege Vercingetorix inside the hilltop fortress, one to defend against the relief army attacking from outside. What military historians consider among the most technically demanding siege operations in ancient history. What those 8 years created was not just an experienced army. They created veterans who would stop a charge midway, dress their ranks, and resume, because they had been doing exactly this kind of thing together for a decade. Suetonius describes Caesar's essential character with the phrase, amazing energy, both physical and mental. He dictated letters while on horseback. He could sleep anywhere, in any conditions. He suffered from episodes that some ancient sources describe as falling sickness, and modern scholars variously attribute to epilepsy, malaria, or other conditions. The diagnosis remains genuinely disputed among historians, and no ancient source describes it affecting his command decisions. What is documented is a commander who operated according to 2 tactical principles above all others. Celeritas, the speed that stripped opponents of their ability to respond, and improvisum, the surprise that multiplied every advantage by making it unexpected. He had written his own strategic philosophy into a letter to his advisors in March of 49 BC, preserved through Cicero's correspondence. Let this be our new method of conquering, to fortify ourselves by mercy and generosity. He arrived at Pharsalus at 51 years old, commanding an army that had fought together for a decade. With a philosophy of warfare built on speed, surprise, and the deliberate decision to treat enemies as future allies. His opponent had been preparing his own kind of career for even longer. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was born on September 29, 106 BC, in Picenum, a region of northeastern Italy where his family were wealthy provincial landowners, not ancient Roman nobility. His father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, was the first of the family to achieve senatorial rank, becoming consul in 89 BC. He died in 87 BC, under circumstances ancient sources describe ambiguously, possibly disease, possibly murder by his own soldiers, who reportedly resented him. The younger Pompey inherited the estates, the clients, and the army at age 20. Within 3 years, he had used all three to make himself one of the most powerful men in the Roman world. Sulla's campaign to recapture Rome needed allies. Pompey provided 3 legions he had assembled from his father's veterans and regional supporters, joining Sulla's march as an independent commander. Sulla, who was not easily impressed, demonstrated his assessment of the young man's ability by sending him to Sicily and then Africa to destroy the Marian resistance there. Pompey completed both campaigns with such efficiency that his soldiers, Plutarch records, began calling him Magnus, the Great. He was 25. He had never held the consulship. He had never followed the traditional path of Roman advancement. And when he demanded a triumph on his return, Sulla, the dictator, yielded to him, and Rome's most powerful man gave way to a 25-year-old from the provinces because that 25-year-old had demonstrated he was not a man you simply said no to. The career that followed was genuinely extraordinary by any measure. In 67 BC, the Senate granted Pompey an unprecedented command over all of Rome's seas and coastal territories to address the piracy that had been choking Roman trade for years. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 zones, cleared each one systematically, and completed the entire campaign in 90 days. The following year, he took command of the war against Mithridates, the 6th of Pontus, Rome's most persistent eastern enemy. And his campaigns over the following 6 years reorganized the entire eastern half of the Mediterranean world. He defeated Mithridates and Tigranes of Armenia. He captured Jerusalem. He reorganized Syria, Pontus, and Bithynia as Roman provinces. He returned to Rome in 61 BC, having added more territory to the Republic than any commander since Scipio Africanus, celebrated a 3rd triumph. 3 triumphs was unprecedented. And then did something that his opponents and admirers both found remarkable. He disbanded his army voluntarily. This decision is worth pausing on, because it defines something essential about Pompey that his eventual failure at Pharsalus tends to obscure. He believed in the Republic, not strategically, not as a useful fiction, but genuinely. The man who could have marched into Rome with his eastern legions and taken what he wanted chose instead to disband his men and request that the Senate honor his settlement of the eastern provinces. They refused, initially, but the principle that a Roman general submitted to civilian authority rather than imposing his will through military force was the principle Pompey had actually lived. Caesar never did. By 48 BC, Pompey was 57 years old, commanding the Senate's armies in Greece with every numerical advantage the Republic's resources could provide. Plutarch records that his pre-battle instinct was against fighting, that he had ill signs and tokens of misfortune in his sleep, and preferred to continue starving Caesar through superior sea power rather than risking a pitched engagement. What changed his mind was not a tactical revelation. It was the men in his camp. The senators traveling with the army were so certain of victory that Plutarch and Caesar independently document the same astonishing detail. They were actively quarreling about which of them would succeed Caesar as Pontifex Maximus, and many had sent agents to Rome to rent houses appropriate for men who would shortly return as consuls and praetors. Both sources record this independently, which increases the credibility of what would otherwise sound like historical embellishment. The pressure this created on a general who needed Senate support for his political future was the pressure that brought him down from the hills on August 9th. On January 4th of 48 BC, in the depths of winter, without adequate transport ships, or without the fleet cover that Pompey's 300 vessels provided his side, Julius Caesar crossed the Adriatic Sea. The Senate expected him to wait for spring. The winds and weather expected him to wait for spring. Caesar crossed in January with 7 understrength legions, landing in Epirus and beginning the march toward Pompey's winter quarters before Pompey could fully respond. His second in command, Mark Antony, was left at Brundisium with 4 more legions, unable to cross because Pompey's fleet had moved to blockade the Adriatic. Caesar was on the far shore with fewer than half his forces, facing an enemy who would eventually have both numerical and naval superiority. Nor he seized what he could, the cities of Apollonia and Oricum, and then made the decision that military historians still debate. He attempted to besiege Pompey's larger army at Dyrrachium, constructing approximately 15 miles of circumvallation works to cut off his opponent from the surrounding countryside. The smaller army besieging the larger. It has almost no precedent in ancient warfare at this scale. Caesar's own account of the campaign, Book 3 of his Civil War, documents the conditions with the matter-of-fact candor of a man writing for posterity. His troops were reduced to eating bread made from a plant called cara, normally used as animal fodder. They went hungry so consistently that when a delegation of starving Caesarians showed the chara bread to Pompey, he reportedly told his staff not to let the information spread because the men they were fighting were more animals than humans. The siege held for months, maintained by will and discipline against a force that was better supplied, better rested, and larger in every category. Then 2 Gallic cavalry commanders named Farsales and Agis defected to Pompey's side after being caught embezzling their men's pay. They knew Caesar's fortification layout with intimate precision. They told Pompey about a weakness in the southern wall where the fortifications met the sea. On July 7th of 48 BC, Pompey launched a coordinated assault by land and sea. Caesar's forces were overrun at the breach. Roughly 1,000 Caesarian soldiers died. Several military standards were captured, a significant humiliation in Roman military culture, dissalst where the loss of a standard represented the partial destruction of unit identity. Caesar's own account records the losses without minimization because he had no reason to minimize them. What happened next became one of the defining episodes of Caesar's military philosophy. Pompey did not pursue. His forces had broken through, scattered a significant portion of Caesar's army, and created an opening that, had it been exploited, might have ended the civil war on that July afternoon. Caesar himself, according to Plutarch, remarked that the victory would have belonged to the enemy had there been anyone among them to gain it. He is recording this critique of his opponent in his own historical account, which makes it more credible, not less. No man invents unflattering observations about himself. Caesar retreated eastward into Thessaly, and he needed food, and Thessaly's grain fields provided it. Pompey followed, under pressure from the senators in his camp, who accused him of prolonging the war to extend his own command, and who considered the outcome of any pitched battle a foregone conclusion. The pursuit brought both armies to a plain near the ancient city of Pharsalus. And there, after weeks of maneuvering along a river called the Enipeus, the men who would decide what the Roman world became for the next 5 centuries finally stopped moving and faced each other across the summer heat. The battlefield of Farsalus has been argued over by scholars for nearly 2,000 years. Caesar himself, in his Civil War, calls it merely the Battle in Thessaly. 4 ancient writers, the author of the Bellum Alexandrinum, Frontinus, Eutropius, and Orosius, specifically placed the engagement at Pharsalus, the older of the two nearby cities, rather than Pharsalus proper. The modern convention of calling it the Battle of Pharsalus is itself a simplification, a name applied by later historians to an event the participants described by geography rather than a specific city. The most comprehensive modern analysis of the battlefield location was conducted by John D. Morgan in a 1983 paper published in the American Journal of Archaeology. Working from the topographical details Caesar provides in the Civil War and cross-referencing them against the physical landscape, Morgan concluded that the battle was fought on the north bank of the Enipeus River, near the modern village of Creni, formerly called Driscoli, approximately 6 miles north of the modern city of Farsala, Greece. His analysis was supported by the presence of Hellenistic period pottery sherds at that location indicating ancient habitation, and by the identification of an ancient road junction matching Caesar's descriptions. The scholarly consensus has since moved substantially toward Morgan's location, endorsed by researchers including Lucas, Holmes, and Shepard, though not unanimously. What matters for understanding the battle is not the precise spot, but the terrain's essential features. The Enipeus River, approximately 60 to 70 meters wide with banks roughly 6 meters high, ran along the southern edge of the battlefield, as both armies anchored one wing to this obstacle. Caesar rested his left wing on the Enipeus. Pompey's right wing was similarly fixed. The practical consequence was that neither army could be flanked from the south. Every aggressive maneuver would have to take place on the open northern end of the plain, where the terrain offered no natural cover and no constraining geography. This is not incidental. The Enipeus didn't just shape the battlefield. It made Pompey's cavalry plan the only viable aggressive option available to him. With his right wing fixed against the river, his 7,000 horsemen on the left wing were the only force capable of flanking movement. Caesar, who had precisely 1,000 cavalry to match against them, understood this mathematical reality as clearly as Pompey did, and the river told Caesar exactly what was coming. His entire battle preparation was built around that knowledge. For several consecutive days before the engagement, Caesar brought his army out from camp in battle formation, advancing incrementally toward Pompey's hilltop position. Pompey's forces moved down the slope to meet him, but never fully descended to the plain. Caesar's own account describes a patient negotiation of terrain. He refused to attack uphill at any disadvantage, advancing close enough to impose psychological pressure without offering the kind of unfavorable engagement that Pompey's superior numbers could exploit. He was actually in the process of striking camp to march elsewhere, to find better foraging and perhaps a more favorable position. When, on the morning of August 9th, then he observed Pompey's army beginning its full descent to the plain. He stopped the march immediately and formed his battle line. Whatever Pompey's reasons for finally descending, and the scholarly consensus attributes it primarily to the overwhelming pressure of the senatorial faction in his camp, though Pompey's own reasoning is not documented. The result was what Caesar had been maneuvering to create for weeks. Both armies on level ground, neither with a terrain advantage. The river anchoring both southern flanks, and on the northern end of the line, the space where the decision would be made. The battle Caesar had designed for was beginning. The question was whether everything he had hidden in the dust would hold until it was needed. And what the two armies that formed on the Pharsalian plain on the morning of August 9th actually looked like, their organization, their depth, the positioning of every major element, is documented with unusual precision in Caesar's own civil war, supplemented by Plutarch, Appian, and the tactical analyst Frontinus. This is one of the most thoroughly described ancient battle deployments in surviving literature. which is both a gift to historians and a reminder that the most detailed account comes from the man who won. Pompey deployed his forces in the standard Roman triple line, what military professionals of the era called the triplex axies, but with a modification that Frontinus specifically notes. His cohorts were drawn up 10 ranks deep rather than the standard 6. The effect was mass, a depth that would absorb the initial Caesarian assault and grind it down through sheer accumulated weight. His most reliable Roman troops, the 1st and 3rd legions, originally Caesar's own legions that the Senate had ordered surrendered, were placed on his left infantry wing, adjacent to the cavalry. Metellus Scipio commanded the center with the Syrian legions. The weaker Cilician and Spanish cohorts held the right wing against the Anapaeus, where the river made active maneuvering impossible. Pompey himself positioned on the left, where he could personally observe the cavalry operation that his entire plan depended on. The cavalry. 7,000 horsemen drawn from Gaul, Germany, Thrace, Anatolia, and Syria, supplemented by archers and slingers from Rome's eastern client states. The Plutarch describes them in terms that are more than colorful. They are tactically relevant. Goodly young men, he writes, bravely mounted and armed with glistening gilt armors, their horses fat and very finely kept. These were, in many cases, the sons of Rome's aristocracy. Men whose training was genuine, but whose experience of actual close-quarters combat against seasoned opponents was limited. The distinction between skilled cavalry and tested cavalry would matter in about 3 hours. Caesar's deployment was built around a different arithmetic. 80 cohorts, many understrength after Dyrrachium. Caesar's own account implies some cohorts numbered barely 1,000 men. He thinned his lines to approximately 6 ranks to match Pompey's frontage, placing Mark Antony in command of the left wing with the weakened 8th and 9th legions combined into a functional force, Domitius Calvinus in the center with 6 legions, and Publius Sulla on the right with Caesar's most trusted unit, the 10th legion. Caesar positioned himself personally on the right wing, the endangered wing, facing the cavalry threat, the place where the battle would be decided. His 1,000 cavalry sat on the extreme right, and behind them, invisible in the dust, was what Caesar's civil war describes as a 4th line. He had withdrawn cohorts from the 3rd line of each of his legions and positioned them obliquely behind the right wing, angled to strike any force that attempted to wheel around the Caesarian flank. Plutarch gives the size as 6 cohorts totaling 3,000 men. Modern analysis, in accounting for the understrength state of Caesar's legions, suggests the actual fighting strength was closer to 2,000. The West Point Military Academy's historical analysis of the battle places the figure at 3,000 to 4,000. The honest range, given the sources, is somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 veterans positioned where no one on the Pompeian side could see them. Caesar told them before the battle began what was coming and what they needed to do. He told his cavalry the same thing. The entire right wing knew its job was not to win. It was to hold long enough for the 4th line to become the most important 2,000 men in the Roman world. One more element remained before the armies moved. At the front of the 10th Legion, a retired centurion was walking forward to make good on a promise. Gaius Crastinus was approximately 37 years old at the time of Pharsalus. He had joined the legions around 65 BC, initially serving in units Pompey had raised in Spain before transferring to the 10th Legion when Caesar formed it in 61 BC. He had been personally selected by Caesar. He had fought through the entire Gallic Wars, the Rhine crossings, the British invasions, the siege of Alesia. 8 years of continuous campaigning that made the 10th Legion the most celebrated unit in Rome's armies. He had reached the highest rank available to an enlisted soldier, Primus Pilus, the 1st spear centurion, commanding the 1st century of the 1st cohort, outranking every other centurion in the entire legion. And then he had retired. He came back as a volunteer. Caesar documents this himself, and in Book 3 of his Civil War. Not through a secondary source, not through a later biographer, but in his own account of the battle he commanded. There was in his army, Caesar writes, a volunteer named Crastinus, who the previous year had been first centurion of the 10th Legion, a man of preeminent bravery. When the signal to advance was given, Crastinus addressed the 120 volunteers of his century who would follow him into the front of the Caesarian line. "Follow me, my old comrades," he told them, "and display such exertions on behalf of your general as you have determined to do. This is our last battle, and when it shall be won, he will recover his dignity, and we our liberty." Then he turned to Caesar as he rode past, marshaling the battle line, and said, "General, and I will act in such a manner today that you will feel grateful to me, living or dead." Modern scholars have examined this speech with appropriate skepticism about its precise wording. The Grocopedia analysis of Crastinus notes that his address mirrors Caesar's own publicly stated justifications for the civil war almost exactly. Caesar's dignitas and his soldiers' libertas are the two war aims Caesar articulated repeatedly in his own communications. And here they are placed in a centurion's mouth. Whether the speech is verbatim or shaped by Caesar's literary purpose, the substance is consistent across sources that mention Crastinus. What is not in doubt is the act itself. A man who had already earned his discharge, who had no obligation to be on this field, who walked to the front of the line and led 120 volunteers into the Pompeian right wing at a full charge. Caesar's account of his death is specific. Crastinus fought with what the Civil War calls the utmost bravery, before being killed by a sword thrust through the mouth that came out at the back of his neck. After the battle, Caesar ordered men to search for Crastinus, specifically among the thousands of bodies on the field. He found him. He decorated the corpse with military honors, a posthumous military decoration, which Roman practice generally reserved for the living. He gave Crastinus a separate tomb, apart from the mass graves where the other fallen were buried. Appian records that Caesar later stated he was personally in Crastinus's debt and erected an altar in his memory. Ross Cowan, and in his scholarly work on Roman battle tactics, has advanced the hypothesis that Crastinus may have performed a devotio, a ritual act in which a Roman soldier pledged his life to the gods of the underworld in exchange for divine favor in battle. The Italian historian Luciano Camfora offers a different interpretation, characterizing Crastinus as something closer to a political commissar, a man whose absolute devotion embodied the Caesarian cause for the troops around him. Both readings are explicitly scholarly interpretations, not documented facts. What is documented is simpler and perhaps more powerful than either interpretation. A man who had already done his part came back to do it again, made a specific promise to the commander he served, and kept it. The armies were moving. The distance between the lines was closing. Behind the dust on the Caesarian right, 2,000 veterans waited in absolute silence for a signal that had not yet been given. Standard Roman military doctrine held that both infantry lines should advance to close the distance between them, generating the momentum that made the pilum volley devastating and turned the subsequent gladius work into something approaching inevitable. Both armies moving meant shared chaos, shared exhaustion, shared vulnerability. The principles had been developed over centuries of successful warfare, tested against every enemy Rome had faced, refined by the accumulated experience of the legions. Standard doctrine, in other words, worked. Pompey chose not to follow it. On the advice of Gaius Triarius, Pompey ordered his infantry to stand their ground and receive Caesar's charge rather than advancing to meet it. Caesar records the tactical reasoning in his own civil war, and it was not irrational. If Pompey's men remained stationary, Caesar's soldiers would have to run double the normal distance, arriving at contact already winded while Pompey's men stood fresh and organized. The pila Caesar's soldiers threw would carry less velocity, having been launched from men who had just sprinted across an open plain. The impact of the Caesarian charge would be cushioned rather than amplified. What this reasoning missed is what Caesar identifies immediately afterward in his own text, and making his critique of Pompey's decision one of the most unusual passages in ancient military literature. A general criticizing his enemy's tactics in his own account of winning the battle. To me, Pompey seems to have acted without sufficient reason, Caesar writes, for there is a certain impetuosity of spirit and an alacrity implanted by nature in the hearts of all men, which is inflamed by a desire to meet the foe. A general should endeavor not to repress this, but to increase it. The charge itself, Caesar argues, is part of the weapon. Pompey's decision to deny his men that charge didn't protect them. It stripped them of something that fighting men need. The evidence for Caesar's position arrived in the form of 22,000 veterans demonstrating what a decade of campaigning together actually produced. Caesar's soldiers were advancing at the full run that standard doctrine prescribed when they noticed, collectively, without any order, purely through the operational instinct of experienced troops, that the Pompeian line was not moving. Caesar's own account records what happened next as an act of spontaneous collective discipline that he clearly found remarkable. His men stopped themselves mid-charge. On their own initiative, the Caesarian line halted almost exactly halfway between the two battle formations. They dressed their ranks. They recovered their breath. They made sure their pila were properly positioned. And then they resumed their advance and closed the remaining distance. 22,000 men stopping a charge by collective instinct without breaking formation, though represents a degree of unit cohesion that no amount of recruitment could substitute for. This was 10 years of shared experience made visible in a single coordinated moment. When the lines finally met, pila thrown at short range, gladi drawn, shield walls pressing together, the initial resistance from Pompey's 10-deep formation was significant. Depth buying time even against superior individual quality. Neither line broke quickly. The killing was close and methodical and mutual. But the infantry center's function in Caesar's design was never to win. It was to hold, to absorb the Pompeian pressure, while the actual decision was made somewhere else. On the right wing, the thunder of 7,000 cavalry beginning their charge was already audible above the clash of the main lines. Titus Labienus had given his order. Titus Labienus had been Caesar's most capable legate throughout the Gallic Wars. He was approximately the same age as Caesar, born around 100 BC in Singulum, Picenum, a region where Pompey's family held enormous patronage influence over the local gentry. Labienus had risen through Pompey's networks before transferring to Caesar's service, and the resulting question of which loyalty ran deeper had divided Roman military opinion for years. In January of 49 BC, after Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Labienus became the only senior Caesarian legate to defect to the Pompeian side. Caesar sent his baggage after him. One of the few documented gestures of that campaign that contained genuine personal bitterness, disguised as courtesy. Pompey made Labienus commander of the cavalry, and Labienus knew Caesar's tactical methods as well as anyone alive. He had watched Caesar build the 10th Legion. He understood the principles of celeritas and improvisum that governed Caesarian operations. He had spent years executing those principles on Caesar's behalf. At Pharsalus, The knowledge that should have made him dangerous instead made him predictable, because he assumed the man he knew would fight the battle the man he knew always fought. He did not account for the formation behind the dust. The cavalry charge was exactly what Pompey's plan required. 7,000 horsemen, backed by archers and slingers from Rome's eastern client kingdoms, swept into Caesar's 1,000 cavalry on the right wing. The result was not surprising. The Caesarian cavalry gave ground, a fighting withdrawal that was, as subsequent events make clear, at least partially deliberate, buying space and time rather than fighting a hopeless holding action. Plutarch, in his Life of Pompey, describes the Pompeian horsemen as they pursued. Young Roman aristocrats, on well-bred horses, equipped with elaborate armor, confident in their superiority. That confidence was not unreasonable. The Caesarian cavalry was in retreat. The archers and slingers were advancing into the space it had vacated. The open flank of Caesar's right wing, the flank where the 10th Legion stood, where the battle line had no cavalry cover, where 5 minutes more of pursuit would bring 7,000 horsemen into the unprotected rear of the entire Caesarian formation, was exposed and closing. From his position on the right wing, Caesar was watching. His Civil War records that before the battle, he had told the 4th line specifically what to watch for and what to do when they saw it. This was the moment. The Pompeian cavalry was beginning the wheeling movement that would bring them around the Caesarian flank. The archers were advancing. The plan was succeeding. Every commander on that field who could see the right wing clearly would have concluded, in that moment, that the battle was effectively over. Caesar gave the signal. The 4th line moved. The Pompeian cavalry came around the Caesarian flank expecting open ground. What they found instead was a wall of infantry that should not have existed. 2,000 veterans, or perhaps 3,000. The range is honest. Emerged from the dust and heat of the Thessalian afternoon at a run, advancing obliquely from the position behind the Caesarian right wing where they had been invisible throughout the entire engagement. They were not throwing their pila. They were carrying them. What happened next is described by 2 different ancient sources with 2 different levels of specificity. And the distinction matters for establishing what is documented versus what is interpreted. Caesar's own Civil War records the outcome directly. The 4th line drove back the cavalry, killed the archers and slingers, and then wheeled to attack the exposed left flank of Pompey's infantry. Caesar summarizes it himself in Book 3. The victory originated from those cohorts which were stationed in the 4th line to counteract the cavalry. It was by these that the cavalry were repulsed, by these that the archers and slingers were massacred, and by these that the Pompeian left wing was surrounded and the rout commenced. This is the primary source's own assessment of his own battle. Caesar knew what won it, and he said so. Plutarch's Life of Caesar and Life of Pompey add a detail that Caesar's own account does not include: the method. According to Plutarch, Caesar had instructed the 4th line not to throw their pila in the standard manner, but to aim them upward at the faces of the cavalrymen, specifically at their eyes. Plutarch's Life of Pompey preserves what may be a near verbatim account of what the cavalry encountered. Caesar's soldiers, he writes, rushed forward and struck at the faces of the enemy. Being unskilled at fighting and unaccustomed to wounds in that part of the body, they could not endure the blows upon their faces, but turned their backs and covered their faces with their hands. Plutarch is writing approximately 150 years after the battle, drawing on sources that are no longer available to us. His account is vivid and internally consistent, but the face targeting detail is Plutarch's record of events, not Caesar's. A distinction that matters when establishing what is documented versus what is dramatic embellishment of an already dramatic fact. What all sources agree on is the result. The Pompeian cavalry, one of the largest and most elaborately equipped cavalry forces ever assembled for a Roman civil war engagement, broke. 7,000 horsemen fled from approximately 2,000 infantry. The archers and slingers behind them, now exposed and unable to escape, were destroyed where they stood. Titus Labienus, who survived the rout, fled to the island of Corcyra and then to Africa, where Frontinus records he subsequently told the remaining Pompeian forces that Caesar had been mortally wounded at Pharsalus. The specificity of that lie, Labienus chose to tell people Caesar was dead rather than admit the cavalry had failed, captures in a single detail the completeness of the disaster. The fourth line did not stop after routing the cavalry. Following the orders Caesar had given before the battle began, it wheeled inward and struck the left flank and rear of Pompey's infantry. At almost the same moment, Caesar committed his fresh third line, the Triarii, the veterans held in reserve throughout the entire engagement, to a renewed frontal assault on the Pompeian center. Our Pompey's legions found themselves under pressure from three directions simultaneously. Fresh Caesarian veterans pressing from the front, the fourth line rolling up their left flank and rear, and the knowledge that their cavalry, their protection, their decisive weapon, the element their entire battle plan depended on, was somewhere behind them, running for its life. On the Pompeian left wing, the commander who should have responded to this crisis was watching from a position that gave him the best possible view of what was happening. Pompey had not moved. Plutarch's Life of Pompey is the primary source for what happened next, and it needs to be engaged with the acknowledgement that Plutarch was writing roughly 150 years after these events, drawing on sources, including the eyewitness account of Asinius Pollio, who was present at the battle, that are no longer independently available. What Plutarch records is consistent with Appian's account and consistent with the behavioral pattern documented throughout the Civil War. It is not eyewitness testimony. It is ancient biography reconstructing the internal experience of a man who lost everything in an afternoon. Pompey watched the cavalry rout from his position on the left wing. He had been stationed there precisely to observe the decisive operation. He saw Labienus's 7,000 horsemen, the force he had built his entire battle plan around, the element that should have wheeled behind Caesar's lines and crushed his army between two advancing formations, turn and flee. He saw the infantry he had thought was winning the frontal engagement now facing attack from the flank and rear. He saw his battle dissolving. Plutarch records that Pompey was struck dumb. He turned his horse. He rode back through his own lines without giving any order, without rallying any unit, without committing any reserve, without attempting any tactical adjustment to the collapsing situation around him. He rode to the camp, dismounted, and sat in his tent. The silence that followed is what Plutarch documents, and what makes the passage so remarkable. Pompey sat while his army broke outside. He sat while Caesarian soldiers overran the camp's outer defenses. He sat in a tent prepared for a banquet. Plutarch notes the silver plate, the decorated couches, the food arranged for a celebration that would not come, and did nothing. When it became clear that the camp itself was falling, he finally rose, disguised himself as an ordinary soldier, and left through a rear gate with a small escort. He rode toward the coast. His wife Cornelia was waiting on a ship off Lesbos. He needed to find a way to reach her and then decide what came next. Why Pompey collapsed rather than adapted is the question that military historians have been answering in different ways ever since. The scholarly consensus, articulated by Goldsworthy and Greenhalgh, among others, identifies a structural rigidity in Pompey's tactical thinking. His entire battle plan was a single-phase operation with no alternative. The cavalry would envelop Caesar's right wing. The infantry would hold. The encirclement would destroy Caesar's army. When Phase 1 failed, there was no Phase 2. Caesar had built a plan that included multiple contingencies, positioned himself at the point of maximum uncertainty, and held reserves specifically to exploit the opportunities that uncertainty created. Pompey had built a plan that assumed success. He had never prepared for what to do when the cavalry ran. Whatever the cause, the effect was documented. Suetonius preserves, through the eyewitness account of Asinius Pollio, Caesar's reaction when he surveyed the battlefield afterward. The shorter version, in Suetonius, they would have it so. The longer version preserved in Appian, they chose this. They would have condemned me, Gaius Caesar, despite my victories, if I had not sought the army's help. These words, whether spoken exactly as recorded or shaped by the memory of witnesses writing them down years later, capture the essential truth of what Pharsalus meant to the man who won it. He had not wanted this war. He had been offered no acceptable alternative to fighting it. And now, surrounded by the bodies of senators who had driven him to this field, he stood over a battlefield and offered his verdict on their choices. Outside the tent where Pompey had sat in silence, his army was running. The Pompeian infantry broke in sequence. The left wing went first. The units closest to the destroyed cavalry, closest to where the fourth line was rolling up the flank, the troops who had watched their protection flee, and then felt pressure arriving from a direction they had no formation to meet. The collapse spread rightward along the line as unit after unit concluded that staying in position meant dying in position. Men abandoned their formations. Officers lost control of their cohorts. The triplex aces that Frontinus had described as 10 ranks deep dissolved into something that ancient sources record with the same word in multiple languages. Flight. Caesar's forces pursued immediately. His own account in the Civil War records that despite the summer heat, despite the exhaustion of an engagement that had lasted from midday through the early afternoon, he urged his men not to stop at the Pompeian camp, but to continue pressing. He was correct about the tactical necessity. An army in full rout that is allowed to halt and reorganize can reconstitute itself. An army in full rout that is pressed continuously tends to dissolve completely. Caesar had seen Pompey fail to pursue at Dyrrachium. He did not repeat the mistake. Pompey's army reached his camp. Caesar's forces overran it. Plutarch's record of what the camp contained deserves to be quoted as historical evidence rather than dramatic color. Silver plate, couches decorated with boughs, tables laid with food, the physical preparation for a victory celebration by men who considered the outcome a formality before the battle was fought. The senators had sent agents to Rome to rent suitable houses. They had quarreled about offices before a sword was drawn. The camp told the story of what confidence without competence produces. The remnants of Pompey's army that could not escape toward Larissa retreated to a hill called Kalogyros, northeast of the battlefield. Caesar surrounded it with 4 legions, cutting off the road toward the city. By evening, approximately 24,000 of Pompey's soldiers were trapped on the hill without food, water, or a commander who had not already fled. They spent the night on the hillside. The following morning, August 10th of 48 BC, they surrendered their arms. Caesar's own account of the battle's casualties, preserved in Book 3 of his Civil War, gives these figures: approximately 15,000 Pompeian dead, 24,000 prisoners, 180 military standards, plus 9 legionary eagles captured. His own losses: no more than 200 ordinary soldiers, plus approximately 30 centurions. Modern scholars treat these figures with appropriate caution in both directions. Caesar's 15,000 Pompeian dead is almost certainly inflated. World History Encyclopedia and most contemporary military historians prefer a figure closer to 6,000 killed on the battlefield itself. Caesar's 200 Caesarian dead is almost certainly minimized. The scholarly estimate runs closer to 1,200. The 24,000 prisoners is generally accepted as approximately accurate, since mass surrenders leave physical evidence that is harder to distort than casualty counts. What is not in dispute is the 9 eagles. Each eagle represented a Roman legion, not a unit defeated, but a unit destroyed as a fighting formation. 9. The Senate had sent armies to Greece. Caesar was sending 9 destroyed legions worth of evidence back to Rome. The most consequential decision Caesar made after Pharsalus was not a military order. It involved a quantity of correspondence he chose not to read. Pompey's private papers were in Caesar's hands within hours of the camp's capture. Letters from senators, communications from allies, off records of who had promised what to whom. The complete documentary record of the Republican faction's private deliberations. In a Roman political culture that treated information as a weapon and enemy correspondence as evidence for prosecution, this archive represented the most comprehensive blackmail material in the history of the Republic. Caesar burned it without reading it. Plutarch records this act explicitly. The message it sent to Rome was unmistakable, and Caesar had articulated its logic in a letter to his advisors in March of 49 BC, a letter preserved through Cicero's correspondence, before he won anything. Let this be our new method of conquering, to fortify ourselves by mercy and generosity. The policy was not improvised in the aftermath of victory. It was designed before the campaign began, Varge as a deliberate strategic instrument aimed at making reconciliation with defeated enemies more attractive than continued resistance. The pardons that followed from this policy were extensive and genuinely remarkable by Roman historical standards. Marcus Junius Brutus had fought with Pompey's forces, and after the battle, fled through marshland to Larissa. He wrote to Caesar from there, asking for clemency. Plutarch's Life of Brutus records Caesar's response directly. He was delighted at his safe escape and bade him come to him, and not only pardoned him, but actually made him a highly honored companion. Plutarch further records that Caesar had instructed his officers before the battle itself not to harm Brutus in the fighting, either to capture him if possible, or to leave him alone rather than kill him. Some scholars attribute this specific protection to Caesar's relationship with Brutus's mother Servilia, one of his long-term lovers. Others identify the propagandistic value of having a man of Brutus's family connections and reputation publicly reconcile with the winning side. Both interpretations are scholarly analysis of a documented fact. Caesar's motivation for the instruction is not recorded in any primary source. What happened afterward is documented history rather than interpretation. Caesar appointed Brutus governor of Cisalpine Gaul in 46 BC, then city praetor for 44 BC, then named him consul designate for 41 BC. Gaius Cassius received a military command immediately after Pharsalus. Both men received every honor Caesar could provide. On March the 15th of 44 BC, 3 years and 7 months after Pharsalus, both men were among the approximately 60 conspirators who stabbed Julius Caesar 23 times on the Senate floor. A Cambridge University Press scholarly analysis of Caesar's Civil War leniency notes that his pardoned enemies rushed to avail themselves of his mercy, but were not tightly bound to Caesar in chains of reciprocity once they had received it. The recidivism rate among Caesar's pardons, men who were pardoned and then returned to opposition, suggests that gratitude, as a political instrument, operated less reliably than Caesar's model required. The philosopher Florus, writing approximately 2 centuries after the events, articulated the structural paradox with precision. His very power of granting favors weighed heavily on free people. In Roman aristocratic culture, receiving a pardon from a peer was not merely an act of political reconciliation. It was a demonstration of subordination. Men who had commanded armies against Caesar were now in the position of owing their continued existence to his deliberate choice not to destroy them. That kind of debt, in that culture, generated resentment as readily as gratitude. Caesar was right about the strategy. He was wrong about the men. The difference cost him everything. Pompey escaped the battlefield disguised as an ordinary soldier and reached Larissa, where he found a small group of supporters willing to travel with him. And his wife Cornelia was waiting on the island of Lesbos with a portion of the family's portable wealth. And reaching her was his first objective. He reached the coast, found a ship, and sailed. He was 57 years old. He had just lost the largest battle of his career. And he was making decisions about what to do next in a world where every calculation had changed. Plutarch records that Pompey considered going to Parthia, the Arsacid Empire, Rome's most feared eastern rival, the power that had destroyed Crassus's army at Carrhae 9 years earlier. The logic was not without its own terrible coherence. Parthia had reason to resist Caesar's eventual expansion, and a Roman general of Pompey's reputation could offer valuable military counsel in exchange for sanctuary and possibly support. He rejected the idea, but whatever his reasoning, pride, genuine patriotism, the calculation that Parthia would extract too high a price, he chose Egypt instead. The choice made its own kind of sense. Ptolemy XII Auletes, the previous Egyptian king, had been one of Pompey's clients. A king whose position in Alexandria had depended substantially on Roman support, specifically Pompey's support. His son, the current pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, was still a boy, barely 14 years old, whose court was managed by advisors. Pompey had earned the family's debt. He expected it to be honored. He arrived at Pelusium on September 28th of 48 BC, the day before his 58th birthday, though he would not reach that birthday. The Egyptian court's calculation was coldly rational and required no great insight. Caesar had won at Pharsalus. Caesar was now the master of the Roman world. A king who harbored Caesar's defeated enemy was a king who had made an enemy of the master of the Roman world. A king who eliminated Caesar's defeated enemy and presented him with the evidence had demonstrated both loyalty and usefulness. The advisors around Ptolemy XIII chose usefulness. Pompey was invited to leave his ship and come ashore in a small boat. Lucius Septimius, a former Roman soldier who had once served under Pompey, a man who owed his military career to the general he was about to kill, was waiting in the boat. As Pompey stepped toward the shore, Septimius stabbed him from behind. His wife Cornelia and his son watched from the deck of the ship that had brought him. He was killed on the beach. His head was severed and his body left stripped and abandoned in the Egyptian sand. But he was 57 years old when they killed him, 58 for exactly 0 days. Caesar arrived in Alexandria 3 days later. When Ptolemy's court presented him with Pompey's severed head and signet ring, multiple ancient sources record that he wept. Plutarch notes his disgust and sorrow. Suetonius records that he recoiled from what was offered to him. Caesar's own civil war, characteristically more restrained, documents his distress without elaborating on its nature. Whether the grief was genuine mourning for a man who had been his son-in-law, performed emotion calculated to demonstrate clemency, or some mixture of both that even Caesar himself could not have separated. Historians have been debating it since the 1st century BC. What is documented is that he ordered Pompey's assassins executed, arranged for his ashes to be returned to Cornelia, and then became embroiled in the Egyptian dynastic dispute that would keep him in Alexandria for the next year and introduce him to Cleopatra, the man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 90 days. who had celebrated 3 triumphs no other Roman had matched, who had voluntarily disbanded his own army to prove his faith in republican institutions, was buried in foreign sand by order of a king whose father he had protected. History preserved his reputation. It could not protect his person. Pharsalus did not end the war. It ended the possibility of the Senate winning the war, which is a different thing entirely. And the distinction kept soldiers dying for 4 more years. Cato the Younger was the clearest illustration of what the distinction meant in human terms. Cato had been Caesar's most determined ideological opponent throughout the crisis. The man who had sworn publicly to prosecute him, whose principled obstinacy had done as much as any single political actor to make the Rubicon crossing inevitable. When Pharsalus made further military resistance in Greece impossible, Cato withdrew to Utica in North Africa with Metellus Scipio and the remnants of the Pompeian forces that had escaped the battle. Cicero and Marcus Junius Brutus accepted Caesar's clemency and returned to Rome. Cato did not. In April of 46 BC, Caesar defeated Metellus Scipio at the Battle of Thapsus in North Africa. Scipio committed suicide to avoid capture. Cato received the news of the defeat at Utica, where he was in charge of the civilian population that had backed the Republican cause. He spent the evening reading Plato's Phaedo, a Socratic dialogue about the immortality of the soul and the philosopher's willingness to face death, and then stabbed himself. Surgeons were called. They sewed the wound. Cato tore out the stitches and died. Plutarch records this specifically. It is not a rhetorical flourish or an ancient embellishment. It is documented behavior that reveals something essential about the man who performed it. Cato was not a general who had lost a battle. He was a philosopher-politician who had concluded that survival under Caesar's rule was a form of defeat that the wound in his side could solve. Caesar reportedly wept when he received word of Cato's death, and said that he begrudged Cato the preservation of his reputation. I begrudge you your death," the line attributed to him by several ancient sources, is among the most revealing things Caesar is recorded to have said about any of his opponents. He understood that Cato's refusal of clemency was itself a form of victory, denying Caesar the political benefit of forgiving his most principled enemy. The fighting continued westward. Gnaeus and Sextus Pompey, the sons of Pompey the Great, organized resistance in Spain with whatever forces and reputation the family name could still gather. Titus Labienus, who had fled Pharsalus, lied to his men about Caesar's death and continued fighting through the North African campaign, joined them. The final engagement came on March 17th of 45 BC at the Battle of Munda in southern Spain. Labienus commanded the Pompeian cavalry, as he had at Pharsalus, when Caesar's allied forces appeared on the Pompeian flank during the battle. Labienus moved his cavalry from the front lines to meet them. His own infantry, watching their cavalry leave the line, interpreted the movement as retreat. They broke and ran. Labienus was killed in the rout. Appian records that Caesar dispatched men to locate the body of his old friend and had him buried with full honors, a gesture so consistent with his treatment of Crastinus that it creates its own pattern. Caesar honored the men who served him faithfully, and the men who had been his before they chose against him. He honored them with the same respect, regardless of which side they died on. The Republic endured as a legal fiction until Augustus, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir, he completed the transition to empire in 27 BC with enough diplomatic sophistication to make one-man rule feel like republican restoration. What died at Farsalis was not the republic's form, but its substance. The genuine contest between competing power centers that had defined Roman politics for 4 centuries. The form persisted. the competition stopped. The chain of consequences that runs from the plain outside Pharsalus to the world the Mediterranean became stretches over a century and touches almost every political reality of the Western tradition. It is worth tracing, because understanding what Pharsalus actually built requires following that chain through several generations of violence and reconstruction. Caesar returned to Rome with the war effectively decided by Pharsalus, but not yet finished. He was named dictator for the second time shortly after the battle, for a term of 1 year. After Thapsus and Cato's death in 46 BC, he was named dictator for 10 years. In early 44 BC, the Senate granted him the dictatorship for life, Dictator Perpetuo, a title with no precedent in Roman republican tradition, since dictatorships were constitutional emergency appointments with time limits, not permanent offices. Caesar accepted it. He also accepted divine honors, divine associations with Jupiter, and the right to wear triumphal regalia at public ceremonies. He declined the title of king when it was offered in theatrical public presentations, though the staging of those presentations was ambiguous enough to leave the question of whether he was actually declining permanently genuinely unclear to contemporary observers. On March 15th of 44 BC, the Ides of March, approximately 60 senators, organized primarily by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, both pardoned at Farsalus, stabbed Caesar 23 times in the hall of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day. He died at the base of a statue of Pompey. Whether history arranged this as commentary or coincidence is not documented. What Suetonius records about his final moments is that when he felt the blows, he pulled his toga over his face so that he might fall with dignity. The famous line from Shakespeare, "Et tu, Brute," is not in any ancient source. It is dramatic invention, however perfect its dramatic logic. What the ancient sources actually record is a man who covered his face with his toga so he might die decently. That is, in its own way, more Roman than any theatrical last words could be. The assassin's plan, to restore the Republic after Caesar's removal, presumably reverting to whatever constitutional order had existed before the Rubicon, collapsed within weeks. Mark Antony exploited Caesar's funeral into a political demolition of the conspirator's reputation. Caesar's will, naming his great-nephew Octavian as his heir, introduced a 19-year-old of exceptional political intelligence into the vacuum Caesar had left. The wars of the Second Triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus against Brutus and Cassius, ended at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide when their forces were defeated. The wars between Octavian and Antony ended at Actium in 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra both committed suicide. One in 27 BC, Octavian accepted the honorific Augustus from a senate he controlled completely, becoming Rome's first emperor in everything but the name he was careful not to claim. Two things survive from this entire sequence in the daily life of every person alive today. One is structural. The model of executive authority exercised through the forms of republican consent, which Augustus perfected and which became the template for the Western political organization for 2,000 years afterward. The other is calendrical. Julius Caesar commissioned a calendar reform in 46 BC, creating the Julian calendar of 365 days, with a leap year every 4th year. Pope Gregory XIII modified it in 1582 to correct a small accumulated error in the calculation of the solar year, Murin producing the Gregorian calendar currently in use across most of the world. The month named for Julius Caesar appears on every device you own. The plain in Thessaly, where 22,000 of his soldiers faced 45,000 opponents on an August afternoon, is what made the calendar reform possible. The battle gave Caesar the time to reform the world. The world has been keeping time by his revision ever since. 2,073 years after Caesar concealed 2,000 veterans behind his right wing on a Thessalian plain, military academies teach what happened there as a case study in principles that technology has not retired. This is not antiquarian sentiment. The specific weapons are obsolete. The specific tactics are specific to the ancient world. The principles they demonstrated appear in every subsequent generation's military doctrine because they describe relationships between forces that do not change when the weapons change. The first principle is what military theorists from Napoleon onward have called operating on interior lines, maintaining a central position that allows rapid movement of reserves to the decisive point before an opponent distributed across a wider front can respond. Caesar's central position at Pharsalus allowed him to observe both wings simultaneously and commit the fourth line at the exact moment of maximum opportunity. Pompey's forces, distributed across a front that was necessarily wider given his larger army, could not respond to the fourth line's appearance because the distance his uncommitted units would have needed to travel to counter it was greater than the time available. The smaller army using interior lines can mass at the decision point faster than the larger army using exterior lines. Caesar demonstrated this principle 15 centuries before military theorists formally codified it. And he demonstrated it against an opponent who had every other advantage. The second principle is concealed reserves. The force held back from the initial engagement and committed at the crisis point where its unexpected presence multiplies its physical effect by a psychological factor that no arithmetic of numbers can capture. Caesar's fourth line was hidden until needed, emerged at the moment of maximum Pompeian commitment, and produced a collapse out of proportion to its size. The Duke of Wellington applied the same principle at Waterloo in 1815 when he ordered his foot guards to lie down behind a ridge and rise to meet Napoleon's old guard at the precise moment their appearance would be most psychologically devastating. The weapons were different. The principle was identical. Military history records its rediscovery in different forms across different centuries because it works regardless of what the weapons are. The third principle concerns terrain as a tactical instrument rather than a backdrop. The Enipeus River at Pharsalus was not a coincidental geographic feature. It was a structural element of Caesar's entire defensive concept. By anchoring his left wing on the river, he eliminated the possibility of Pompeian cavalry action on that flank, forcing the entire cavalry threat to the northern end of the line, where he had prepared his counter. Modern military field manuals describe terrain appreciation as a fundamental planning requirement, because the same lesson applies whether you are deploying Roman legions or mechanized infantry. The side that understands and uses the terrain fights a different battle than the side that merely fights on it. The fourth principle is the one Pompey illustrated by failing to apply it. Numerical superiority is a real advantage. It is not destiny. The side with more soldiers wins, on average, more often than the side with fewer soldiers. But on average is not always. And the gap between average and always is where preparation, concealment, reserve timing, terrain appreciation, and the willingness to design a battle around a surprise rather than a head-on advantage creates the outcome that the numbers said shouldn't happen. Pompey arrived at Pharsalus with twice Caesar's infantry and 7 times his cavalry. Caesar arrived having studied the terrain, having designed a formation that existed nowhere else in Roman military doctrine, having positioned himself at the endangered point to observe the crisis, and having held his best available forces in reserve for the moment when their emergence would be most disorienting. The pattern this represents has not changed. Numerically superior forces have lost to smaller, better prepared opponents throughout recorded military history, from the Persian Wars through Vietnam and beyond. Not because numbers stopped mattering, but because commanders who believed their numbers guaranteed victory stopped solving the tactical problem and started planning the victory celebration. Pompey's senators were renting houses in Rome before the battle was fought. That detail is not merely colorful. It is the mechanism of the defeat made visible. An army whose commanders believe the outcome is certain stops doing the preparation that would actually make the outcome certain. Caesar's fourth line was not brilliant improvisation. It was the product of a commander who had read his opponent's plan correctly, designed a counter in advance, concealed it successfully, and committed it at the precise moment its appearance would break everything Pompey had built. The military theory involved had no name in 48 BC. It has several names now. It appears in every professional military's doctrine. It still works. The ruins of ancient Battle of Pharsalus lie in Thessaly under agricultural fields. There are no monuments at the probable battlefield site near the village of Crene. The plain where Caesar concealed his decisive reserve grows wheat and cotton. Visitors who make the 3.5-hour drive from Athens to the modern city of Farsales will find a landscape that has changed very little since the summer of 48 BC. Low hills, the valley of the Enipeus, open ground that a professional soldier would still read as a cavalry approach on the northern end, and a natural anchor on the south. The terrain still tells the story for anyone who knows how to read it. We began with screaming cavalry, 7,000 horsemen who broke and fled from infantry that should not have been there. That image has a name now. The fourth line. Approximately 2,000 veterans positioned in the dust of a Thessalian afternoon, holding their pila instead of throwing them, emerging at the crisis point of a battle that Caesar had designed around their emergence. The final accounting of Farsalus requires honest handling of uncertain numbers. Caesar's own civil war records approximately 15,000 Pompeian dead. Modern scholars revise that figure downward to approximately 6,000, noting that ancient generals had every reason to inflate enemy losses and minimize their own. And the 24,000 prisoners who surrendered on the Kaloyiros hill the morning after the battle is generally accepted as approximately accurate. Mass surrenders leave physical evidence harder to distort than casualty counts. Caesar claimed fewer than 200 of his own men dead. Modern military historians estimate closer to 1,200. Every figure in this battle requires a caveat because one of the men writing the history was the man who fought it. That is not a reason to distrust Caesar. It is a reason to read him the way he deserves to be read, as a primary source with a perspective, not as a neutral observer. Gaius Crastinus, who came back from retirement to make Caesar a promise and keep it, was given a separate tomb and military decorations that the Romans generally reserved for the living. Caesar recorded his name and his words in the history that has survived 2,000 years. The Primus Pilus, who volunteered for one more battle, is one of the most specifically documented common soldiers in ancient history, and almost no one outside the scholarship knows his name. History works this way more often than not. It preserves the systems, the commanders, the battles, and loses the individuals who made them possible. Pompey died on a beach in Egypt the day before his 58th birthday, killed by a man who had once served under him, watched by his wife and son from the ship that had brought him. Caesar wept when he saw the signet ring. Whether the grief was genuine, performed, or some Roman mixture of both that the culture provided no clean language for. The ancient sources record it, and historians have been arguing about it for 20 centuries. Some questions don't resolve. They simply persist. The Julian calendar, reformed by Caesar in 46 BC and modified by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, is the calendar currently used in most of the world. The month of July is named for the man who ordered 2,000 veterans to hide behind his cavalry on an August morning in 48 BC. His battle plan shaped the world long enough for his calendar reform to stick, You are living in the consequences of Pharsalus today. Every time you check the date, the plain outside modern Farsala has no monuments. The battle that redirected the trajectory of Western civilization for 5 centuries is marked by agricultural fields and silence. The fourth line's position has long since dissolved into the soil. But the principle it demonstrated, that preparation at the right point, held in reserve until the right moment, can break what numbers say cannot be broken. Waits in every military doctrine, in every planning session where a smaller force faces a larger one, in every commander who needs to understand that the side with more soldiers wins on average, and average is not destiny. Caesar proved that once. The plain in Thessaly where he proved it doesn't remember his name anymore. His calendar still tells you what day it is.